Hey, this is Todd, and this is the second video in my film to table series, and the topic for this one is genre conventions. So when I'm thinking about things when we're trying to bring in a certain feel, and again, the idea of this was bringing in things from fictional media, TV movies, and comics and all that into gaming. One of the first things that popped into my mind was the idea of sort of what genre that we're playing and what expectations as a player and as a referee we have about that genre. So I'm not going to go in defining all the kinds of different genres. I'll probably use a few as examples, but I think we're all familiar with sort of the larger genres, whether it's fantasy, sci-fi, drama, historical, true crime, mysteries for that. And then within those, lots of subgenres. What really the goal of this video is to talk about getting your expectations of when you have a genre, thinking about what that genre is and, being as detailed and specific as you can, and then making sure that when you're planning a campaign and pitching it to your players and setting it up, that everybody's on the same page as far as those expectations are concerned. And the reason I say that is because I think that of the sources of tension that can arise within a game, I think that one of the main sources is that when you as a referee or you as a player have a different idea of what the game is about, what game you're playing really, right, than your other players or the referee, the GM, and that leads you to making choices or making decisions that then, or thinking up ideas or having, ideas about your characters or ideas about what you're going to do that are dissonant with the other people in your group at your table, if they don't share those same conventions. So, right, if you're playing if the referee who's running the game thinks you're playing a sort of low magic, gritty, realism kind of fantasy game, and you think you're playing sort of a high magic Gonzo game, everything you do from when you sit down at that table is going to potentially, cause tension, cause friction, which is going to lead to a poor, experience. If you think that when you encounter an owlbear that you can jump on it and ride it like a pony because that's kind of the crazy sort of Gonzo game you think you're running, and the referee and maybe other players at the table think you're doing something more hardcore, sort of grimdark, serious, gritty kind of game, that's going to lead to issues. And the same thing if you're the referee and you've planned sort of a Gonzo kind of wild and crazy sort of game and your players aren't approaching it in that way, it's going to maybe be frustrating for them, and it's going to be frustrating for you because you might be expecting them to take certain actions to move things forward. They're playing it a totally different way. And, it's going to lead to tensions. It's going to lead to things not working the way you think they should. You won't understand why your players aren't, getting it, doing things that you think, they should be doing. And your players are going to be stuck trying to figure out why aren't these things that we're doing, we feel like we understand the game, and yet the expectations are not there. They're trying to get, why aren't you understanding them, or why aren't the things that they think should be working the way they should? And, there are multiple reasons for that, but I think a big one comes down to that genre expectations, right? So if you're planning a game, you're sitting down to think of a campaign, I think it's important to think about, what that genre is. And, again, we could talk generally saying, okay, it's a fantasy game, right? You're playing D&D, it's a fantasy game, and that's great. And there are certain expectations in a fantasy game, right? There's going to be, potentially monsters. There's going to be usually, magic. There's going to be, other elements that are in there. It's going to be, medieval style, or unless you say otherwise, right? Because you could play a fantasy game taking place in ancient Greece or Mesopotamia, and that's something, part of that setting that you would express. But I think within there, you want to think about, well, where on this, there's a whole universe of fantasy, where can you pinpoint where your game's going to be? Is it going to be more Gonzo, where you're going to have guys flying, riding around on ostriches, and they're dragons, and they're flying around, and there's a spaceship that crashes, and you're going to have guys with battle axes, and then you're going to be guys with laser swords, and it's just going to be sort of crazy. Are you playing something that's going to be very much more grounded in sort of whatever, say it's a medieval style realm, or again of a different type of setting? It's going to be very sort of grounded, and magic is going to be rare, and monsters are supposed to be scary, and you're supposed to you know, treat everything as being very, you know, lethal and not take a lot of, say, the kind of chances you would take in a Gonzo sort of thing? Or is it approach like, say, you're going to say, well, it's a fantasy Western, you know, and what does that, when you're combining fantasy with Western, what does that mean for the kind of goals and the kind of things that your players are supposed to be doing? Or it's, you know, you're going to be playing, you know, sci-fantasy, or maybe you're going to be mixing in sci-fi elements with your fantasy, or, you know, it's going to be, well, I think, you know, Metamorphosis Alpha, maybe it'd be a really early idea of combining the two, right? Where it takes place on a giant ship, but within that ship, you guys have been, or the humanity, or whichever has been on that ship so long that they've forgotten due to some accident, they were sort of trapped in, you know, basically a giant, you know, and sort of a, I don't know what, almost a big, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, biodome, right? And you descended back to see being more of a medieval society within this biodome. And then you're kind of escaping and you're running into sort of this high technology that was all around you, but hidden because you didn't know what you were looking for. So there's, you know, obviously a ton of different genres in there and subgenres. And each one of those is going to have certain things that are going to affect you and your creativity and what you're trying to pull out of it. And they also inform the players about what sort of game they're playing. If you're playing a fantasy Western, for example, right, that means you're sort of combining, you know, the setting and the elements of fantasy with the ideas and concepts of things of a Western. You know, I think a lot of people will look at sort of old D&D and, you know, OSR type D&D and look at it as sort of a fantasy Western, right? You're on a frontier, you're pushing into the unknown, you know, surrounded by hostiles with sort of little pockets of civilization around you. That's very much like a lot of Westerns worked, where, you know, you had people on the frontiers trying to do something, but, you know, that there are these little safe points like, oh, there's a fort or there's this town. But in between there, you had outlaws and, you know, hostile, you know, native tribes and, you know, all these different elements that kind of filled up the middle that made it very dangerous to get from, say, Carson City to, you know, whatever fort that's lying somewhere else. And so that was a big element of the game. And it fits a lot of fantasy if you're thinking about that kind of frontier play. But this is something that you're going to want to figure out. And, you know, it's something you're going to want to have to articulate, or you're going to want to articulate it, because the more that you and your players can be on the same page about what you're playing, then that will align all your decisions, sort of how everything works. If I'm expecting to play sci-fantasy game, and really you're expecting that maybe there's a little sci-fi in there, but you're not really meant to, to really work with that. Really, that's just a little bit of fluff, because I'm really doing this sort of fantasy Western style approach, right? And the sci-fi part's just a little sprinkling on top. That's going to lead me to try to do things that aren't going to fit with you. If I'm constantly trying to interface with this technology, because I think that's a core part of the game, and the referee's looking at it like this is just a little bit of fluff, a little bit of sprinkling, it's not meant to be interacted with, then we're not on the same page. And not being on the same page is going to cause issues. So I think it's one of those things that when we talk about, I think, session 0 and all these things about really setting up the campaign, what you're doing is you're creating a good base upon which you can build everything else, and so that it has kind of a firm foundation. And the genre you pick is going to do a lot for you, as far as it's going to help center you as sort of, once you have that figured out, then it will influence all the decisions you make. If I'm running a sci-fantasy campaign, then when I'm thinking of things and I'm thinking of obstacles or monsters or everything, the sci-fi part of that is going to influence, it's going to inform the things I do and the decisions I make. And it's also going to influence the kind of things that your players are going to think about, right? If I'm running a Gonzo style fantasy anything goes campaign, that's going to be different than if I'm trying to run sort of a high chivalry Arthurian campaign, both from what I create and also from what I expect of my players to do. In an Arthurian style campaign, I don't want them just going crazy, trying every little thing, because I want them to think about it in terms of, you know, the sort of chivalry and romance of sort of the high, you know, medieval sort of age. That's how I want them to treat it. I don't want them to treat it like it's just some kind of crazy, you know, do whatever you want. Oh yeah, there's a horse, just jump on it and do whatever. Oh, there's this thing, just run over and do that. No, I want them to think about it and be more in that grounded, or at least in a certain setting. Like I want to play, you know, Excalibur the game, and, you know, they're trying to play Kung Fury. it's not going to work out. And it's going to cause a lot of problems down the line that you'll see things that are symptomatic, right? There's things that are going to rise out of it that you could look at it and you're looking at a symptom when the underlying problem is that divergence of genre expectations. You may things like, boy, this player is always arguing with me, or, you know, I always have to sit there and fight about when I say no, you know, that big thing that comes up. Oh, you should never say no. You should say yes all the time. And that's a great idea. But the problem with that is sometimes what you're trying to do when you say no is you're trying to be true to this expectation of the genre you have. If I'm trying to play a gritty game, I don't want to say yes to everything if that's going to lead to some crazy, you know, peasant railgun type situation. So I'm going to say no. I'm trying to enforce the fact that, hey, this is a gritty, down to earth game. We're not trying some crazy, you know, stuff that in my view, in the terms of the campaign, is nonsensical, right? But the player, if they don't know that, then they're just looking at it's like, man, this guy's just being unfair and he's hammering at me and not letting me bring my, you know, creativity to bear. Well, yeah, if you look at it in just that symptom, it is in terms of like, oh, maybe this GM's being too narrow-minded or whatever. But really, it comes down to if we're on the same page with what sort of game we're playing, and if we both know we're playing this sort of gritty, down-to-earth, kind of low magic, grimdark campaign, then I feel like my mindset as a player is not going to lead me to try to build something crazy, like try to build a giant ladder to the moon or whatever, or flap my arms if I fall off a cliff thinking it'll help save me from dying, because that's not the game it is. It's not just a fun sort of tune-like, you know, game. I'm not going to try to do that because I understand what game is. And, you know, theoretically, I've signed off on it, right? If we're doing the whole session zero thing and we're sitting down and talking about, hey, this is the kind of game I want to run. It's going to be sort of a grim, dark, you know, low magic, high lethal sort of medieval fantasy game. And I sign off on it and I say, great, I want to play and let's work on my character and things. Then, you know, I've signed off on it. I'm aware of it. I know then I'm not going to think about something that doesn't fit that, because my mindset with my character should be, this is the game we're playing. If we don't have that conversation, if we haven't both kind of signed off on it and put it out there and sort of written it down and everybody kind of agreed to it, then how am I to know that this is what you're asking, or these are off limits, or, you know, out of bounds? So I guess to sum up, you know, might seem like a little thing or something that's easy to just flippantly throw out and say, you know, hey, we're playing a fantasy game. Like, just say, hey, we're playing D&D, right? But, you know, obviously you can look on forums, you can read different games, and something like D&D or really any game at all can go in a lot of different directions. Particularly games like D&D, they don't have sort of a very narrow focus. If you're playing, you know, Monster of the Week, it says right there in the game, Monster of the Week. That's what you're playing, right? It's very kind of fixed, and the game itself helps enforce the genre. But a lot of other games, particularly in the D&D style mold, they actually take a very hands-off approach about what the genre is. So you can't just assume when you say, hey, we're playing D&D, that we have this equal idea of what it means, because the D&D genre is huge. And if you watch something like Critical Role and then you watch some other thing, other stream, or, you know, read play reports, or just look at games that are playing at your local gaming store, or just surf on Roll20 or Twitch any given night when people are running games, you'll see that there's a super wide variety of games that are being played. So setting that genre, or setting that subgenre or sub-genre can be super important to making sure that that foundation for your game is solid, that everybody's on the same page. And then when you're working through ideas and you're working through play and you're making your decisions and the players are making their decisions, that you're looking at the world in the same way, right? You guys share the same worldview, whatever that worldview may be. And so, you know, think about it next time you're starting, or even if you're having a refresher with your players, or if you feel like there is that sort of dissonance with your players of the way they're playing and maybe they're not sure about the way you're playing. And a lot of times, again, once you're in the game and these things are happening, it's easy just to look at specific little things that I think are symptomatic of that genre problem, but it can be hard to look past them. You just think that they're being goofy, and they may think you're being unfair or whatever it is, right? And that's where you get stuck. But, you know, it could be something to take a moment, think about the genre, write it down, or put it in a way you can express it. And then the next time, you know, before your game, after your game, if you're already in session playing, you know, sit down and say, hey, let's just talk about, you know, here's what I think we're playing, or this is the genre that I'm creating for, and get that kind of hammered out. And obviously, if you haven't started yet and you're forming a game, definitely put that as far as your session zero checklist, which is, not only have a genre and subgenre and all that worked out for you internally, but make sure that that's communicated to all your players. Make sure that everybody's on the same page and that you all understand it. And I think it'll really help get your game started with a nice, steady foundation. But, I'll have more to say with the other topics. But again, it's one of those things that maybe isn't as exciting on some levels, talking about some other things, because it's kind of maybe even a little bit boring to think about. But I think it's important. We're laying the groundwork. We're laying the foundation. So I hope this video was useful. If you like these, please think about subscribing to the channel, because it helps me a lot. If you'd like to help me out another way, I have a Patreon link in the show notes that I would be happy if you'd like to support me in that way. But other than that, please have a great day, and I will talk to you later.